in the world of survival. We call it the rule of threes. How many of you remember the rule of threes? Because I've talked about it before. Their hands go up, right? The rule of threes is important in a survival situation. Basically, you can survive 3 weeks without food. You can survive 3 days without water. And you can survive about 3 hours without shelter. And you use that mentality when you are prioritizing what must I do to survive. And there's going to be variations. I mean, when I say 3 weeks, 3 days, 3 hours, there's variations because you got to think in certain conditions that might not be the truth. For example, if you're in the desert, shelter just became a priority. You got to protect yourself from the sun, right? So you got to find some way that you're going to make some shade before you roast. And that could be potentially really roasting. You could actually find yourself quite burned. If you're in the jungle, shelter might mean something completely different. It might be getting off the ground so that the little creepy crawlies don't come and turn you into a meal. And that could be a very important thing. And believe it or not, you also need to stay dry because hypothermia can get you in the jungle. Even someplace that seems warm and humid and you think, no way. Absolutely. We have in survival training, they teach you that really quick, especially if you get wet. If you get wet, the potential to get hypothermia, it can get you even in what seems like warm conditions. But for just a minute though, I want you to change your focus. Imagine that you're here. Cold. I'm not talking about regular cold. I'm talking about that kind of cold. When I was stationed in Alaska, I was part of a team that had the opportunity to participate in something called Arctic Warrior Survival. And they actually took us out into an environment that looked comparable to that. The mountains seemed too close there, but other than that, it was about the same. And they taught us some really important stuff for surviving in Arctic conditions, literal Arctic conditions. We learned how to build little igloos, which was pretty pointless because it took a lot of extra effort for what we were doing. But they also showed us how to make really cool little snow caves that you got into and had an elevated bed inside, and they showed us how to purify water or snow so that we could have purified water to drink. They showed us how to get water from a frozen lake, which can be a lot of work. But to be honest, you know, when you're thinking about survival, there's those things that stick out. And food, obviously, water, I was just talking about, but shelter's the priority. And when you're here, you've got to get warm. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can do that, but included in Arctic survival is fire. Now, fire is important in any survival situation because you need it to purify water, right? You got to boil your water, so fire is just one of those things. But I've got my little can here. Excuse me. And I wanted to talk about it for just a minute. How many of you have ever lived in a really cold environment like this? Anybody? A couple folks?
Astoria.
Not quite. So, when you live in one of those places, it's a good idea to keep a coffee can and a candle in your car. Because if you find yourself in a situation where you're stuck, here's a way that you can have light and warmth. Sometimes hours worth. I don't know how long this candle would last. It's one of the little short fat ones that's in here. But I'm getting enough warmth just off of this, I can feel a temperature change. So if I can do that and I can insulate my car I could potentially create one of those snow caves right there in my car. Now, you do typically lose a lot of heat out of your windows and stuff. Car's not a place that you want to survive. But something like this can make a tremendous difference. So go back to my snow cave concept. They showed us how to make fire. And we have things, we don't have coffee cans like this in our gear most of the time in the military, but I did have a little metal cup that my canteen was carried around in. Now, my canteen was plastic. Not much use there for cooking and things like that. But you know what was? That little metal cup. I could melt snow, I could purify it, make tea. We made something called spruce tea, full of vitamin C, and supposedly you don't need to brush your teeth because it kills the stuff in your mouth. But obviously brush your teeth if you can anyway. It's a good idea. Don't want your teeth to fall out. But I want you to imagine these conditions. We're talking about cold. Now, in this case, everything looks pretty static. It's kind of sitting still. But let's change it just a little bit. So I think when I went through Arctic Warrior Survival, it was about 15 degrees outside. That was what we were experiencing. It had been warmer when it would snow, and it had been a little bit cooler. It probably got to about, it probably got down to about 5 or 10 degrees. And I had a sleeping bag that was rated to -20. So I had a lot of warm. We weren't ever in any danger. But let's change it. It's -20. That was a real thing in Alaska. We saw -20 on the regular. -30 was not uncommon. I'm talking about actual temperature. Now let's add the wind. And we know wind. This is a community that knows wind. Supposedly we're going to get some tomorrow. Gusts up to 60. Now imagine those same type of winds coming in, howling through the trees, tearing the snow off the branches, just ravaging the area that you're in. How important is shelter? And how important is fire? Now, let's take this storm and let's add a new element to it. Dark. Because in the Arctic, where I was stationed, the sun came up around 10:30 in the morning this time of year and set about 2:30 in the afternoon. Now at night, if the moon was out, that was as good as daylight. The moon on the snow, some of you have seen that. You know what I'm talking about. You can operate at night if you need to. But go back to the conditions. What if it's a storm? What if it's cloudy? What if there's wind? And the only light that you have is a tiny little source. But that tiny little source, if done correctly, can be all the difference in the world. My hands are warm. With just that little bit of difference, with my hands over the candle. Ooh. Seriously, long enough to feel that. I'm 6 inches off the candle. The whole can's getting warm. I had to set it down. You see what I'm talking about? In a little bit of time, that fire makes all the difference. Pretty brutal conditions, right? Let's talk about some conditions, though, that are even more brutal than this. Not Arctic cold, not desert sun, not even jungle bugs. I'm talking about a world without hope. Christmas is supposed to be a season of hope. But that may not be where you find yourself today. For some of you may feel like you're sitting in darkness. Your world might seem dark. It might seem bleak. It could seem very, very cold. Maybe you don't think that the storm's going to get you, but maybe that's exactly what you feel like. I know where some of you are in things that you're going through, things that you're suffering with. I know that there's people who are going to watch this online and they're struggling with depression and anxiety and fear. Maybe the curse of sin visited you this year in some way. Maybe death came for someone that you love. Maybe disease crept into your life and it reminds you daily that life is fleeting. Perhaps sin ravaged your life in some other way this year. Perhaps someone else's sin left you the victim. And now your heart is full of rage or even hate. And you're struggling to put the pieces back together to navigate tomorrow. Maybe it's your own sin that has imprisoned you. Maybe the destruction of addiction came to your family, your home. Maybe your own sin has left you feeling imprisoned, unable to escape that thing that continues to drag you down over and over again. And so perhaps this isn't a Merry Christmas at all. Maybe you aren't filled with joy and light. Maybe you feel like you're sitting in complete and total darkness and you have absolutely nothing to grab a hold of that fills you with hope. And the only thing you feel is the certainty of death. Life, when you consider it at best, is gray, and the wind howls. There's voices in that wind. They drive you down, they tell you things, and you believe them to be true because the environment is cold. And everything around you seems destroyed. If that's where you find yourself today, there's a trick for Arctic survival that applies here now. See, this is a season of hope. But why? Because Jesus came. Now, if you missed the sermon on Sunday, I talked about how God loved us. And that's why Jesus came, so that he could rescue us from our sin. But I also read from Isaiah where a world full of evil made for a very dark place to live. And because of sin's presence in this world, we collectively all will at some time, guaranteed, struggle. Gonna happen. Before Christ came, we were separated from God. And without God, there is no hope. But on Sunday, we saw the difference that just a little bit of light can make. Just a little bit of light. Just a little bit. You want a little bit of light in this cake? Here, share it with your friends. Y'all can share your light. In the Arctic, a spark a spark can mean the difference between life and death. It's why firecraft is so important in survival. Just a spark can be enough to completely change your situation. One that is a certainty of death to one that now offers the hope of life. That's the difference. Just a little tiny bit of light a spark can make. So let's talk about a spark. How about 2,000 years ago, in a tiny town called Bethlehem, a baby was born. And it's the difference between life and death. In Luke 1, verse 78, Zechariah prophesied about his son John the Baptist and the Savior that John would one day introduce. He said, because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide us to the path of peace. And in Matthew 4:15, there's this prophecy about Jesus. It says, in the land of Zebulun and of Naphtali, beside the sea, beyond the Jordan River in Galilee, where so many Gentiles live, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who lived in a land where death cast its shadow, a light shine. Take a breath. Everything just changed. Those who sat in darkness, now there's light. Those who only knew death, now there's life. There was no path to salvation, or life, or hope, or anything good. We were utterly helpless. But it was when we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. Romans 5:6. Now this little spark, this tiny little glimmer of light, let your candle remind you that it was just a tiny little glimmer of light that was born in a stable 2,000 years ago. But he brought with him light and life for everyone. John 1:4 says this about Jesus. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. I started to say we're going to blow these out in a minute. If I cough too hard, I might blow mine out now. In a minute, we'll extinguish these. But they're just reminders. Occasionally, we eat crackers and drink juice, but those are just reminders too. Reminders that he came. But I hope that the tiny flame that you're holding reminds you that hope came in the form of a baby. But it represents a light that shines in the darkness that darkness cannot extinguish. And his name is Emmanuel, which means you are not alone. It means that no matter what crisis or storm you're facing right now, no matter what challenge you're engaged in, you're not sitting in the dark unaided. You might feel like it's the darkest time of your life, but Emmanuel, God with us, the light is there with you. If you're one of those who's sitting in a bleak environment today, I want to tell you that's okay to feel that way. It's all right. I can't tell you to just cheer up. Don't worry, be happy. But I can tell you in honesty, you are not alone. The God of the universe, who loves you so much that he would send his son, He is with you now. Let that tiny little bit of light begin to grow in your life. Because even in the bleakest of environments, may His light of peace, hope, joy, and love shine specifically into your darkness. And let the smallest spark be a reminder that absolute life-saving intervention came at the hands of God in the form of Jesus. May your Christmas be merry and bright because He came.